Okay, so welcome back. I have this video here on connective tissues I want to go through with you. Namely, how did their structure tell you something about their function? It's a common theme with a lot of these things, especially with tissues. It's structure and function. So when we look at tissues, again, they're just a collection of cells and they have some type of common purpose. When they're all together, they do something in common. When they're apart, they each can do their own thing, but they don't function as a whole. One of the things that we notice about tissues is they are composed of cells and sometimes they need to be replaced. If we were to look at an epithelial tissue, they get to be replaced because they happen to have cells inside of them that are called stem cells, which you can see here at the bottom of the picture, which hopefully you can see the mouse flipping over. So stem cells are cells that can reproduce and create more types of cells. And there's various versions of stem cells. So there are stem cells that only make their own kind, but there's also stem cells that can make various other types of cells. And we'll deal with stem cells throughout the year because we actually have quite a few of them inside of our bodies. Epithelial tissues are known for their stem cells. Connective tissues are not. Connective tissues are a collection of three things. I call them cells, gels, and fibers. So the cell is going to be the thing that creates everything else. The gel is something that we call the ground substance or the matrix or the extracellular fluid environment. So you're going to have a cell that's going to create some type of liquidy environment that's either going to be super liquidy or it could be super rigid, kind of like a bone, but the super liquid version would be like blood. And inside of it, you're also going to have proteins. So proteins all over the place, or what I would call the fibers. The proteins, for the most part, are going to be collagen. For the most part, the cell is going to be a fibroblast. And then it's the gel that's going to vary from each one. Sometimes there are other things in there, but we play with that one as we need to. When we look at connective tissues, we put them into three categories. So we have our loose connective tissues. When we look at connective tissues, we happen to have three categories of tissues. For the most part, they're structural, or they're going to be fluid, or they're going to be what we call proper connective tissues. So the three proper connective tissues, structural ones, or fluid ones. When I look at the proper connective tissues, these are the ones that it's very easy to tell cell, gel, fiber. And we break these up into either loose or dense. So when you saw the presentations, the ones that turn out to be proper connective tissues are elastic, reticular, dense, regular, dense, irregular, adipose, and areolar connective tissues. So those ones there, it's very easy to say, oh, cell, gel, fiber, cell, gel, fiber. Easy, clean cut. And here just turn out to be more pictures of them. I will have 5 of the 6 for you. I don't have an explicit slide on dense irregular, even though I can find it for you if we need to. But for the most part, I don't show you dense irregular connective tissue. For the structural ones, there turn out to be 2 major categories, even though there's technically 4. So the 2 big groups are bone and cartilage. And that seems to be relatively easy because they help make up a lot of actual physical structures. So for the bone, it's insanely easy to tell because it looks like a whole bunch of trees. The cartilages are the oddballs. And I only have, of the 3, I have 1 that I can show you, and that's going to be the hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the super rigid stuff. The difference between cartilage and bone is the nature of the ground substance. The cell is the same, the fiber is the same, the difference is the gel. And it's a very subtle difference between the two. We give the names for the 2 different, so they're all fibroblasts. But in bone, we call it an osteocyte, which means bone cell, and in cartilage, we call it a chondrocyte, which means cartilage cell, but they're all fibroblasts. So we just give these 2 special names. And then you have the fluid ones. The fluid connective tissues come in 2 varieties. You have blood and you have lymph. Lymph is really hard to see, so we don't really look at that, and its composition changes quite a bit. So the one that we primarily look at will be blood. So you'll get to look at some blood slides. Epithelial tissues and connective tissues happen to have a special relationship, and it's called a membrane. So the catch with the word membrane is there's many versions of the word membrane. So you have like a cellular membrane, but you also have an actual anatomical thing called a membrane. And membranes happen to have some parts to it. So there will be a top layer, what we call an apical surface of the epithelial tissue. There'll be a bottom layer that we call the basal surface. And you can actually tell them apart. So the top of the connective tissue, or the epithelial tissue, and the bottom of the epithelial tissue actually will look different. So when you looked at the stratified squamous epithelium, the top of the stratified squamous definitely looked like it was stratified, or it was a whole bunch of squamous, so a whole bunch of flat pancakes. But the bottom, it actually looked like there were cubes in there. And that's because the basal surface is actually where you happen to have the stem cells. So you actually can tell the difference between the top and the bottom of epithelial tissues. They're what we would call polar. But underneath it you have a little connection layer, and it's called the basement membrane or the basal lamina. And that there is what will glue the epithelial tissue down. Every once in a while it will get inflamed, and it's sometimes called the fascia. So when it's inflamed, it's called fasciitis. So if you've ever heard of the flesh-eating disease or necrotizing fasciitis, it's when the connection between epithelial tissue and connective tissue gets inflamed. But all of that together, the epithelium and the connective tissue at the bottom, is what we call a membrane. There turn out to be 4 types of membranes inside of your body. This picture here goes through them all, so if I just go from top to bottom, the first one where it says number 1, that's what we call a mucous membrane. Mucus is one of those horrible words in anatomy and physiology because there's 2 spellings and they mean different things. So this one here, mucus, has an O in it. So that one just means anything that's wet. So your eyeballs, the inside of your mouth, inside of your nose, ears, stuff like that. Those are all mucous membranes. If you get rid of the O, so M-U-C-U-S, that's snot. So it actually does matter if the O is present or not, because you will change the meaning of the word. For number 2, that's what we would call a serous membrane. So do they have serous? Yeah, they do have it spelled. So serous membrane, that is a membrane that's meant for fluid gliding. So it's what allows like your organs to move around inside of you, because they do wiggle and jiggle. And if they didn't have this little layer of fluid, they'd rub up against each other. If they didn't have that layer of fluid in there, they would rub up against each other, and then you'd probably get friction, and then you'd have an inflammation, and you get bruising and swelling, and it would hurt. Every once in a while you're aware of this, because the serous membrane that happens to surround your lungs, it's called the pleura, the serous fluid gets out of the way, and the result is the 2 membranes stick, and when you try and pull them apart, because they're not gliding, it causes that really nasty stabbing sensation that you get in your chest. That's because of a serous membrane. Number 3 is a dry membrane. It's the only one of the 4 that turn out to be dry, and that's what we call a cutaneous membrane. So that'd be your skin. That's it. Number 4 is what we call a synovial membrane, and that's anything at a joint, so it allows for 2 bones to glide past each other. So the fact that you can move relatively easily is because of synovial membranes found at synovial joints. If you happen to lose the fluid inside of them, the result is bone on bone, and it's insanely painful, and typically it's going to then cause an arthritis, and then you either have to take anti-inflammatories, so steroids, or you're going to get the joint replaced.